And so the case went all the way to the Supreme Court. They can't do this. Their states were, the highway funds, the states have learned to feed at the trough. And the states have become dependent on feeding at the federal trough. And so states were saying, oh, lose 5% of our highway funds? We can't afford that. Because the way these projects work, when there's going to be a new exit built on Interstate 35, there will be a local, if it's in a metro area, there'll be a local contingent, the state government, KDOT will provide some of the money, and the Federal Department of Transportation will provide some of the money. And if any piece of the puzzle is cut by 5%, and a 5% can be several millions of dollars, or even tens of millions of dollars, then the project doesn't go. And so state after state after state rolled. They said, we can't afford it. We can't afford to lose any highway funds. And so we will adopt this drinking age. And this was astonishing because the states were giving up their sovereignty. They were saying, we will let the federal government decide. And the interesting thing is, it wasn't the sovereignty owned by the members of the state legislature, it was owned by us, Kansans, and every other state. Now, there were a few states that held out. Vermont held out for quite a while. That was when Vermont was a little more conservative of a state. And the Green Mountain states said, no, we're not going to buckle to this federal pressure. And they held and they held and they held until the 1990s when Vermont finally caved. Hawaii held for quite a while. Hawaii doesn't have a lot of interstates. And even the most grand bridges to nowhere won't go that distance. And so Hawaii held and held and held, but even they eventually caved in. Now, they have much more liberal politics in Hawaii, so eventually they caved. And then all 50 states, and this is real extortion. I mean, the closest to extortion. The federal government was, or bribery. The federal government was saying, you want the money? You do as we regulate as we say. It went to the Supreme Court, and unfortunately, by a vote of 7-2, the court ruled in favor of Congress. That Congress could put those strings on federal money. And there was a great dissent written by Justice O'Connor. And Justice O'Connor had sort of a mixed record on the court. I liked some of her rulings. I disliked some of her other rulings. But on this one, I really liked because she was a champion. Her legacy, one area where she had a very good legacy was on states' rights. She was constantly defending states' rights. And this seems to be part of her history. She'd been a justice on the Arizona Supreme Court, and so I think she had a sense of protecting states' rights for a variety of reasons. But whatever they are, she wrote this decision. She said, look, if we allow this, in essence, we are going to allow Congress to regulate indirectly by holding hostage the states this federal money. And now, fast forward to today, we are in a perfect storm of the spending power. Because the spending power is at its greatest height when Congress is willing to spend with abandon. Can you say $1.4 trillion deficit? Deficit, not deficit? I remember back in the 80s when we thought, oh, someday the deficit's going to be $200 billion. And the world will explode when our deficit is $200 billion. How can our economies, that was going to be like a deficit that was too high. Now, it's just more zeros. And you have Congress, this Democratic-controlled Congress, absolutely willing to just keep spending and spending and spending. And they, of course, as you know, want an additional stimulus plan to keep on spending. And so there's a perfect storm. When the Congress is willing to spend, because that's the only real limit on the spending power, right? And when the states are over the barrel because of a recession. See, state governments, unlike Congress, have to balance their budgets according to state constitutional provisions. And so if a state has to balance its budget, like the state of Kansas had to do recently, then the state legislators have to make some tough choices. And boy, is it easy to make the choice to accept that federal money. And that's what the Kansas legislature did last year, in 2009. They accepted federal money from the stimulus plan, because you know what? The stimulus dollars came with strings attached. The strings attached said that you cannot reduce your K-12 expenditures below 2006 levels, and you cannot eliminate any of the discrete programs in K-12 education in Kansas. So to get stimulus dollars, we had to keep our K-12 spending sufficiently high to meet the desires of the Democrats that control Congress. Now, reasonable people can disagree as to whether that's how much we should spend on K-12. But it's our decision. It's not Congress's decision. But again, legislators of Kansas took the money, accepted the deal, and we were bound by it. And now, We see another tough decision. What did the legislators of Kansas do? Showing us just how unwilling they are to actually cut spending. They were offered a budget by the conservative Republicans that would have balanced the budget in Kansas, which we were constitutionally required to do by cutting spending. But instead, they gave us another asset sales tax. You know, this kind of weak-willed legislature is so easily swayed and strangled by Congress when it's using the spending power.
Wasn't that KS-SoS also budgeted by a federal lawsuit about the education system in the state?
It wasn't a federal lawsuit, it was in state court, because they wanted to get it to the Kansas Supreme Court. Yeah, the Montoy decision where the Kansas Supreme Court, the Kansas Supreme Court is to the Kansas Constitution as Justice Stevens was to the U.S. Constitution. They have a very permissive view where the phrases can be very flexible. Montoy decision is a whole other debate, but yeah, basically they took some words out of context, completely out of context, and the Kansas Constitution said that Kansas has to provide for an adequate education. It doesn't say an adequate level of funding for education. That's not the words in the Kansas Constitution. They twisted the words to mean that. And then they came up with the conclusion that the Supreme Court of Kansas can set spending levels. And that's what they did. But anyway, okay, so spending power. Second Amendment, very quickly. Second Amendment, the D.C. versus Heller decision in 2008, the Supreme Court says what we all knew is that the Second Amendment protects an individual right. And the interesting thing is the Supreme Court had not ruled on that question since 1939 in the Miller case. The Supreme Court had not ruled on whether the Second Amendment, no, you'd say, well, of course it protects an individual right. All of the bills in the Bill of Rights, all of the elements in the Bill of Rights protect an individual right. But the Second Amendment had this interesting phrase. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Well, a number of judges and left-leaning academics came up with the idea, oh, that means the Second Amendment only protects the right of a militia member to own an arm. And a militia member today means a person who is a member of the National Guard. So therefore, the Second Amendment only protects the right of National Guardsmen and Guardswomen to keep and bear arms. And that theory was gaining currency in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s. Finally, even academics started saying, you know, this doesn't even make sense. Of course it's an individual right. Each individual can keep and bear arms. You look at the history of the Second Amendment, and you look at the wording, you understand what the words mean. Well-regulated. You remember the phrase regulars, as in the regulars of the British? It's a regular army, as opposed to a militia army, which is farmers. Regulars are trained professional soldiers. They may not be full-time soldiers, but they are trained. They are regulated. They have become regulars, not irregulars. So a well-trained militia being necessary to the security of a free state. So these are militia members who have training from time to time. Sounds kind of like the National Guard, but that's what it was. Well, what do they mean by the word militia? Well, Justice Scalia, right, this is the other decision I'm going to recommend you read, United States versus Heller, the majority opinion of Justice Scalia. It is a masterwork in constitutional interpretation. He picks every word and he says, look, this is what the word meant in 1789. The militia meant every able-bodied male in the country, every female, over a certain age, right? And he said, that is what militia means. The militia is the body public. The militia is every person capable of bearing arms to defend his country and eligible to do so. Obviously, they had slavery at the time. And therefore, the right to keep and bear arms means that the people have to have their arms so that when the time comes for the farmers, the militia, to gather and defend the country, they will be there to do so. The War of 1812, the Battle of McHenry, Fort McHenry, which our Star Spangled Banner is all about. The Maryland militia, 3,000 militiamen held off a regular army of British professional soldiers of 5,000 who were marching on Fort McHenry. Well, meanwhile, the 19 ships in the Chesapeake Bay were shelling the fort, and miraculously, the fort survived. But it was the Maryland militia, not professional soldiers. Anyway.